The sun had almost set when the rancher named Samuel found the trail stained with blood. He had been riding back from the southern pasture checking the fences when his horse stopped suddenly and snorted. At first he thought it was a wounded animal. Then he saw her. A young native girl lay face down beside a small creek, her long dark hair tangled in the wet grass. Her arm was cut, her leg bruised, and she was breathing faintly. Samuel slid off his horse and hurried to her side. He spoke softly, trying not to frighten her, but she was too weak to answer. Her clothes were torn and one of her moccasins was missing. The trail behind her showed signs of struggle, broken branches and hoofprints that weren't hers. He guessed she had been running from someone or something. Samuel took off his hat and dipped it into the creek, letting cool water run over her face. When she opened her eyes, they were dark and full of fear. "You're safe," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure it was true. He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped it around her wounded arm. Then he lifted her gently, placing her across his horse's saddle. His horse shifted, uneasy with the weight, but obeyed. Samuel climbed up behind and held her steady as they rode slowly back toward his small cabin. The evening turned cold. A distant coyote cried somewhere across the plains. The girl shivered and murmured something in her native tongue, words Samuel didn't understand. Her voice was trembling, frightened, but soft, almost pleading. He whispered that everything would be all right, though part of him wondered if bringing her home was a mistake. Tensions had been high between settlers and nearby tribes. A white man found with a native girl could be accused of anything, but leaving her out there alone didn't sit right with him. By the time they reached his cabin, darkness had fallen. The small fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving faint orange light across the wooden walls. Samuel carried her inside and laid her on his bed. He cleaned her wounds the best he could, using water mixed with whiskey to keep them from getting infected. The girl barely moved, her eyes following him every time he stepped away. When he offered her a little broth, she tried to sit up but couldn't. He helped her drink, then covered her with a blanket. He sat near the fire after that, watching her breathe. Outside, the wind was rising, rattling the shutters. Samuel had lived alone for years, ever since his parents died and his younger brother left to work in the mines. He had grown used to silence. But now, with the sound of someone breathing in the next room, he felt something stir inside him, something that felt like purpose. He wondered who she was, what had happened to her, and who had hurt her. He tried to piece it together. Maybe bandits, maybe soldiers, maybe her own people. The frontier had become a dangerous place where no one trusted anyone anymore. He thought of taking her to town once she recovered, but the thought of explaining it all made his stomach tighten. He decided to wait until morning. As the fire faded, Samuel leaned back in his chair and drifted into sleep. When he woke, dawn had broken, and the light coming through the window was pale and cold. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and looked toward the bed. It was empty. His heart skipped a beat. He stood quickly, scanning the room. The blanket was on the floor. The door was open. He stepped outside and froze. Two men stood near his horse, holding rifles. They were native warriors, silent and stern. And the girl, the same one he had carried home, was standing a few steps away, her arm bandaged, her eyes sharper than before. She looked different now, stronger, wary, watching him like a stranger. Samuel raised his hand slowly. "I didn't hurt her," he said. "I found her wounded, brought her here to help." The taller warrior said something in his own tongue, and the girl replied. Her voice was calm but cold. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They didn't believe him. Before he could speak again, one of them moved forward and grabbed his arm. Samuel didn't fight back. He was outnumbered and had no weapon close enough to reach. They pulled him toward a tree near the edge of his corral. The girl stood there silent as they tied his hands behind the trunk with a thick rope. His heart pounded in his chest. The shorter warrior shouted something, pointing toward the horizon where the creek lay. Samuel didn't know if they planned to kill him or leave him. The girl stepped closer now, her dark eyes scanning his face. He noticed she was wearing his blanket draped around her shoulders. "I saved you," he said quietly. "You were hurt. You would have died." She said nothing for a long time. Then, with a voice low and careful, she spoke in broken English. "You not soldier?" "No," he answered quickly. "I'm just a rancher." She looked at him for another moment, then turned to the warriors and spoke again. They argued softly, their language sharp but rhythmic. Finally, they lowered their rifles. One of them cut the rope from Samuel's wrists, though not gently. He rubbed his hands, thankful to be free, but stayed still, waiting. The girl nodded once, almost as if to say they would leave. But before they did, she stepped closer again. "You help me," she said, her voice quieter now. "Why?" Samuel thought for a moment. The words came out simple and true. Because it was right. She looked confused for a second, as if she had expected another reason. Then her eyes softened just slightly and she turned away. The three of them walked back toward the creek, vanishing into the trees. Samuel stood there for a long time, the cold wind brushing his face. The rope marks on his wrists burned, but he felt more relief than pain. He went back inside his cabin and stared at the bed where she had slept. The blankets still smelled faintly of smoke and rain. He wondered if he would ever see her again. That night, as he sat by the fire, he couldn't stop thinking about her face, the fear, the strength, and the strange calm in her eyes when she realized he wasn't an enemy. Something in that look stayed with him, stirring a quiet ache he didn't understand. The plains outside were silent again, but for Samuel, the silence had changed. He felt as if the world had shifted slightly, as if something had begun that he couldn't yet name. The next morning came slow and quiet, as if the land itself was still half asleep. Samuel stood at his cabin door, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The sky was pale blue, thin clouds stretching across the hills. He kept thinking about the night before, about the two warriors, about the girl, and about how close he had come to losing his life for something he didn't even do wrong. He rubbed the red marks on his wrists and sighed. He wasn't angry. Mostly he felt empty. It was strange how someone could appear out of nowhere, change everything, and then vanish as quickly as they came. His horse grazed quietly near the fence, the saddle still dusty from yesterday. Samuel patted its neck. "Guess we had quite a night, huh, boy?" he murmured. The horse snorted softly, as if agreeing. He spent most of the morning fixing a section of the fence that had fallen during the storm last week. It was hard, slow work, but he liked it that way. It kept his mind busy, away from questions that had no answers. Still, every time he turned toward the hills, he caught himself looking for a flash of movement, a shadow, a shape, anything that might be her. Around noon, he noticed something strange. A few small footprints near the creek, lighter than a man's, leading toward the edge of his property. He followed them quietly. They were fresh, too fresh to belong to the warriors from the night before. His heart started to beat faster. He moved between the trees, careful not to make noise. Then he saw her. She was crouched by the water, washing her face. Her hair hung loose, catching the sunlight like threads of black silk. The bandage he had tied on her arm was still there, but it had been cleaned and rewrapped neatly. She looked stronger now, though there was still a faint weakness in the way she moved. Samuel didn't want to startle her, so he spoke softly. "You came back." The girl turned fast, her eyes sharp as a blade. Her hand reached for the small knife at her waist, but when she saw it was him, she froze. They looked at each other for a long moment, not as strangers but not as friends either. "I now bring food," she said finally, holding up a small leather pouch. Her English was rough but clear enough. She placed the pouch on a rock and took a step back. Inside were dried berries and a small piece of smoked meat. Samuel blinked, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." She tilted her head, studying him carefully. "You help me. I help you." He smiled faintly. "I reckon that makes us even then." The girl said nothing. She looked around the clearing, her eyes cautious, like she expected danger to come from any direction. Samuel realized she was still afraid. Not of him, but of whoever had hurt her before. "You can stay here for a while if you need to," he offered. "No one comes out this way much." She hesitated. "Your people? No, like my people?" "Maybe not," Samuel admitted. "But I ain't most people." Something in his voice must have reached her. She looked at him for another moment, then gave a small nod. "Just one night," she said. Samuel nodded back. "One night's fine." They walked together to the cabin, slow and quiet. He noticed she moved differently than before, not weak and frightened now, but cautious, alert, always scanning her surroundings. Inside, she stood near the door, as if ready to run if needed. Samuel handed her some bread and stew left from last night. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had gone hungry too many times before. When she finished, Samuel asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Naya," she said finally. He smiled. "I'm Samuel." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened a little, and for the first time, he saw something human in them, not just fear or suspicion, but curiosity. The day passed quietly. Samuel worked on the fence again while Naya sat near the porch, sewing a tear in her clothing with a bone needle. He caught himself glancing her way more than once. There was something peaceful about seeing another person there, someone alive in a place that had been empty for so long. As the sun began to set, the light turned golden across the land. Samuel brought a bucket of water and poured it over the porch steps. "There's an extra blanket if you want to sleep inside tonight," he said. "It gets cold." Naya shook her head. "I sleep outside. Safer." He didn't argue. He understood. Trust wasn't something that came easy out here. That night, the air grew sharp and cold. Samuel stayed up late, unable to rest. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the faint sounds from outside, the rustle of wind through the grass, the soft steps of the horse, and once in a while, a quiet breath that told him Naya was still there. Sometime after midnight, he heard movement. Not from her, from farther off, near the ridge. Horses. More than one. He stood quickly, went to the window, and saw faint shapes moving through the darkness. Whoever they were coming this way. He stepped outside quietly and saw Naya already standing near the fence, her eyes wide and alert. "You hear it too," he said. She nodded. "They come for me." "Who?" "Men. From Fort." Her voice shook slightly. "They kill my brother." I run. Samuel's stomach turned cold. He had heard stories about small groups of scouts sent by the fort to clear tribes from the valley. "We can't stay here then," he said quickly. "They'll see the smoke from the chimney." She hesitated. "You stay. They want me." "Not a chance," he said firmly. "You saved my life this morning when you could have let them leave me tied up. I owe you one." For a second, she looked like she might argue, but something in his tone stopped her. They both moved fast. Samuel grabbed his rifle and doused the fire, while Naya collected what little she had. Within minutes, they were on horseback, heading into the woods beyond the creek. The night was moonless, and the trail was rough. Branches scratched at their faces as they rode. Behind them, faint lights flickered, torches, maybe 3 or 4 men. Naya turned once, eyes hard with fear. Samuel urged the horse faster. After nearly an hour of riding, they reached an old hunting cabin, half collapsed and forgotten. Samuel tied the horse behind it and motioned for Naya to follow him inside. The roof leaked and dust covered everything, but it was shelter. They waited in silence, listening. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Finally, Naya sat down, her shoulders trembling slightly. Samuel handed her his coat. "You're safe now," he said quietly. She looked at him with tired eyes. "Why you help again?" He didn't know how to answer. Maybe because he'd spent too long being alone. Maybe because he was tired of watching good people get hurt while others looked away. He just said, "Because someone has to." Naya looked down at her hands, silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "My brother say same before he die." The words hung heavy between them. Samuel wanted to speak, but nothing felt right. Instead, he sat near the doorway, keeping watch while she finally drifted into sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a soft whisper. The land was still, but Samuel knew this wasn't over. Whoever those men were, they'd keep searching. He didn't know why he cared so much about this girl he'd barely met, but he did. Deep down, he knew something had changed in him, something that wouldn't let him walk away anymore. He watched the stars fade behind thin clouds, and for The first time in years he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living for something again. The morning sun crept slowly across the broken cabin, lighting the dust in the air. Samuel woke first. His back hurt from sleeping on the rough floor, but he stayed still for a moment, listening to the soft sound of breathing beside him. Naya was asleep, her head resting against her arm. The faint light touched her face, and for the first time since he'd met her, she didn't look afraid. Samuel stepped outside quietly. The woods were calm, but his mind wasn't. He knew the men who had chased them wouldn't stop. If they worked for the fort, they had orders, and soldiers followed orders until someone told them to stop. He had to think of a plan before night came again. He checked the horse, gave it water, and studied the tracks leading back toward the creek. Nothing new. That meant they had a little time. When he returned to the cabin, Naya was awake, sitting near the fire pit and trying to fix one of her moccasins. She looked up as he entered. "They still looking?" she asked quietly. "Not close," Samuel said. "But they will be soon." She nodded, saying nothing. Her face was calm, but her hands shook slightly as she worked. Samuel knelt down beside her. "We'll ride west," he said. "There's a canyon there. Hard to follow. We can hide until things quiet down." Naya looked uncertain. "You come with me?" "They want me, not you." Samuel smiled faintly. "Maybe so. But if they catch you, they'll say I helped anyway. Might as well make it true." For the first time, she gave a small smile. A real one, brief and shy, but it warmed the space between them. They packed what little they had, some bread, jerky, and water. Samuel led the horse, letting Naya ride since her legs still hurt. The trail west was narrow and wild, full of rocks and dry brush. The land stretched wide around them, endless hills fading into the blue horizon. They rode most of the day without speaking much. The wind carried the smell of pine and dust. Every once in a while, Samuel glanced at Naya, who held on tight to the saddle, her dark hair moving with the breeze. She looked small against the wide world, but there was something strong in her too, something that made him respect her even more. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the canyon. It was deep and quiet, a place most riders avoided. Samuel found a narrow path that led down between rocks. They followed it carefully, leading the horse on foot until they reached a small hollow where the stream ran clear and cold. "This will do," Samuel said. "We can rest here for a while." Naya knelt by the water, cupping it in her hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. No noise, no guns. He sat nearby watching her. "You used to live near here?" She shook her head. "Far north. My people move with seasons. We come here only to trade. Then soldiers come." She stopped, her voice tight. "They said peace, but they bring fire." Samuel felt his stomach twist. He had heard stories like that before, heard them but never seen them. Hearing her say it made it real. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She looked at him and nodded once as if she understood he meant it. They built a small fire using dry branches and cooked what food they had left. When night fell, the canyon filled with the sound of crickets and running water. Samuel leaned against a rock, staring up at the stars. Naya sat a few feet away, silent but awake. After a long time, she spoke. "You live alone long time?" "Yeah," he said softly. "Since I was 20. My family's gone. Just me and the land now. Not lonely." He smiled sadly. "Used to it, I guess. The land talks enough if you listen close." She looked at him curiously. "What'd it say?" Samuel thought for a moment. "It says, everything lives and dies and we're just here in between, trying not to waste it." She seemed to think about that. The fire crackled softly between them, painting orange light on their faces. Later that night, they heard something. A distant echo of hooves again. Samuel froze. "They found the trail," he whispered. Naya stood tense, her hand on her knife. Samuel kicked dirt over the fire and pulled her toward the shadows of the canyon wall. The sound grew louder. 3 riders this time, moving slowly. Their torches flickered along the ridge above. "They don't see us," Samuel whispered. "Stay still." The riders stopped for a moment, talking among themselves. The wind carried faint words, but Samuel couldn't understand. Then after a few long minutes, they rode on, heading east. When the sound faded, Naya finally exhaled. "They not stop," she said softly. "They keep looking," Samuel nodded. "Then we'll keep moving." They waited until morning before leaving. By then, clouds had rolled in, covering the sun. They traveled north along the canyon floor, through tall grass and wildflowers. It was hard work, but Samuel didn't complain. Every mile put more distance between them and danger. By midday, Naya's strength began to fade. Her leg ached from the long ride. Samuel noticed and stopped. "We'll rest here," he said, helping her down. She tried to refuse, but he shook his head. "You're no good to either of us if you fall off the horse." They sat under a tree near a quiet bend in the stream. Naya rested her head on her knees, breathing slowly. Samuel handed her some water. She drank and gave a tired smile. "You different," she said suddenly. "How's that?" He asked. "Other men, they take. You give." Samuel looked away, unsure what to say. "Just doing what's right," she nodded. Right is not easy. They stayed there for most of the afternoon. When the rain started, it was soft at first, then heavier. Samuel used his coat to cover both of them as they sat under the tree. The world grew quiet except for the steady rhythm of raindrops. Something changed in that silence. The fear that had followed them for days began to ease, replaced by something quieter: trust. For the first time, Naya didn't seem ready to run. She leaned slightly closer, her eyes following the falling rain. Samuel felt the warmth of her shoulder against his arm and said nothing. He just let the moment be what it was: simple, human, peaceful. When the rain stopped, they continued north, following the stream until they found another small cave hidden by vines. It wasn't much, but it was safe. They built a small fire and dried their clothes. That night, as Naya slept, Samuel stayed awake thinking. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. If the soldiers were still hunting her, they'd reach the mountains sooner or later. He thought of heading to the old mission near the river, where some settlers and tribes traded goods peacefully. Maybe there she could find safety, or at least a chance at peace. But another part of him didn't want to let her go. The thought of going back to his quiet cabin alone again made his chest ache in a way he didn't understand. When dawn came, he watched the light crawl across the canyon walls. Naya woke, stretching slowly. "We go now?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, standing up. "We go north to the mission. It's safer there." She nodded, but he could tell she was unsure. "You come with me?" "For a while," Samuel said. "Until you're safe." She looked at him for a long time, then said softly, "You already make me safe." The words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't reply, just gave a small smile and began to saddle the horse. The road ahead would be long, but something inside both of them had changed. They were no longer just a rancher and a wounded stranger. They were two souls bound by chance and trust, moving together through a land that had almost forgotten mercy. And though neither said it aloud, both of them knew that the journey ahead would test everything they had left to believe in. The road north was rough and narrow, but Samuel knew it better than most. He had traded at the old mission once years ago when the valley was still peaceful. It sat on a small hill beside the river, surrounded by oak trees and stone walls built by hand. If anyone could offer shelter, it would be the missionaries and traders there. The morning air was cool and smelled of wet earth after the rain. Naya rode quietly in front, her hands resting on the saddle horn. She had grown stronger in the past few days, though her legs still hurt from time to time. Samuel walked beside the horse, leading it by the reins. He could feel her eyes on him every now and then, but she never said much. By noon, they stopped by a stream to rest. Samuel cooked a small meal of beans and bread over a fire. Naya watched him, then asked softly, "This mission, safe?" "As safe as anywhere around here," Samuel said. "People there don't care much about who's white or native. They care more about peace and trade." She nodded but didn't seem fully convinced. "Sometimes peace is only word," she said quietly. Samuel couldn't argue with that. He stirred the beans and thought about how many times promises of peace had been broken in this land. Still, he had to believe there were some good folks left. When they set out again, clouds had begun to form over the mountains. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and pine. Samuel felt uneasy. He kept glancing behind them, scanning the horizon. He thought he saw movement once or twice, small specks against the hills, but he couldn't be sure. By evening, they reached the river. It flowed wide and calm, reflecting the fading light. Across the water stood the mission, just as Samuel remembered. Stone walls, a tall wooden cross, and a few smoke trails rising from chimneys. "We made it," he said with relief. Naya looked at it silently. "Looks quiet," she said. "Quiet's good," he replied. They crossed the shallow part of the river and reached the gate. An old man in a brown robe appeared, leaning on a stick. When he saw Samuel, his eyes brightened with recognition. "Samuel Gray," he said with a small smile. "Haven't seen you in years." Samuel tipped his hat. "Evening, Father Mateo. We're looking for a place to rest a bit. This here's Naya." The priest's eyes moved to the girl. "She's hurt," he said softly. "She's had a rough time," Samuel answered. "We just need some shelter." "Of course," Father Mateo said. "Come in." They followed him through the gate. The mission courtyard was peaceful. Chickens clucked near the well and a few children ran past, laughing. For the first time in days, Naya's shoulders relaxed a little. Father Mateo led them to a small room near the back. "You can stay here," he said. "We have food and blankets. No one will trouble you." "Thank you," Samuel said gratefully. After the priest left, Naya looked around the small room. "Feels safe," she whispered. "Yeah," Samuel said, smiling. "Maybe we can breathe easy for a while." That night, they shared a quiet meal in the mission hall. A few traders sat nearby talking about crops and weather. Naya stayed close to Samuel, still uneasy among strangers. But everyone treated her kindly, and the warmth of the fire eased some of her tension. Later, when they returned to their room, she asked softly, "You go after this?" Samuel hesitated. "I haven't thought that far," he said honestly. "Maybe I'll stay a few days." "Make sure you're settled," she nodded slowly. "You good man, Samuel," he smiled. "I just do what I can." The next morning started peaceful, but it didn't last. As Samuel helped fix a broken wagon wheel in the courtyard, he heard the sound of horses approaching fast. He looked toward the gate and felt his chest tighten. 3 soldiers rode in, their uniforms dusty, rifles slung across their backs. The one in front wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a paper in his hand. He spoke with authority. "We're looking for a native fugitive," he said loudly. "Girl about 16, wounded, traveling with a man." "Anyone seen them?" Samuel froze. Father Mateo stepped forward calmly. "There are many travelers here," he said. "You can rest and eat, but there will be no violence within these walls." The soldier sneered. "We're not here for peace talks, Father. We're here for the girl." Samuel stepped forward before he could think. What's she wanted for? The officer looked at him sharply. "Who are you to ask?" "Just a rancher," Samuel said evenly. "But seems to me a wounded child isn't much of a threat." The soldier's eyes narrowed. "Unless she killed a man." "Which she did." Naya had come to the doorway behind them, silent as a shadow. Samuel turned toward her, shock in his eyes. "That true?" he whispered. She looked down. "They kill my brother," she said softly. "I take knife from him. I stop only one." The words hit Samuel hard. He understood now why she had been running, why the soldiers were after her. It wasn't murder. It was survival. The officer raised his hand. "There she is." In an instant, chaos broke out. Soldiers dismounted, reaching for her. Naya stepped back, fear flashing in her eyes. Samuel moved without thinking. He grabbed the nearest soldier's arm, twisting it hard enough to knock his rifle loose. The gun fell and Father Mateo shouted, "No blood here." But the soldiers ignored him. "Run, Naya," Samuel yelled. She hesitated only a second, then darted toward the back gate. Samuel pushed one soldier aside and followed her. Shots rang out, echoing across the courtyard, but none hit. They raced through the orchard behind the mission, branches whipping their faces. Samuel caught up to her at the riverbank. "We can't cross here," she said breathlessly. "Yes, we can," he said. "Hold on." He pulled her into the shallow water. It was cold and strong, but they kept going until they reached the far side. Behind them, soldiers shouted, but the river's curve hid them from sight. They ran until their lungs burned, finally stopping in a grove of trees. Naya dropped to her knees, gasping. "They not stop," she said. "They come again." Samuel crouched beside her. "Then we keep moving. There's a mining town a day north. Maybe they won't follow that far." She looked up at him with tired eyes. "You could leave me now. Be safe." Samuel shook his head firmly. "You still don't understand, do you? I'm not leaving you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Naya reached out slowly, touching the scar on his wrist where the rope had burned days ago. "I tie you before," she said softly. "Now you save me." Samuel smiled faintly. "Guess that makes us even again." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of the river far behind them. Naya looked toward the horizon, her expression calm but sad. "No home now," she said. Samuel stood and helped her up. "Then we'll find one." They walked through the tall grass side by side, heading toward the distant mountains. The world around them felt wide and uncertain, but neither looked back. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with orange and gold, Samuel realized something deep inside him had changed forever. He had started this journey as a man trying to do what was right. Now he was a man who had found something worth protecting, even if it cost him everything. And though they didn't speak of it, both of them knew the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time they faced it together, not as a rancher and a fugitive, but as two lost souls who had found each other in a land too harsh to forgive, yet just kind enough to let them try again. The morning light spread across the valley like a soft blanket of gold. Samuel and Naya had walked most of the night. Their clothes were wet, their boots heavy with mud, but neither complained. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and far ahead faint lines of chimneys rose above the hills. The mining town. It was a small place called Red Hollow, built around a silver mine. Samuel had been there once before to sell cattle. It wasn't friendly to outsiders, but it was far enough from the fort that maybe, just maybe, no one would be looking for them. As they reached the edge of town, Samuel stopped beside a fence. "We'll stay quiet here," he said softly. "No one needs to know who you are or where you came from." Naya nodded. Her hair was tangled, her face pale from exhaustion, but her eyes were steady. "I'd do what you say," she replied. They walked down the main street. The town was already awake. Miners heading to the shafts, women sweeping porches, and a blacksmith hammering on glowing metal. Samuel tipped his hat to a few folks. Most just nodded back. At the far end of the street stood a small inn with a faded sign that read, "The Silver Lantern." Samuel led Naya inside. The owner, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "You look like you've had a rough trail," she said. "Something like that," Samuel answered. "We just need a room for a few nights. Quiet one." The woman nodded. $3 a night. Supper's extra." Samuel pulled some coins from his pocket, nearly all he had left. "That'll do." When they reached the room upstairs, Naya sank onto the bed, breathing hard. "So many people," she said softly. "Feels strange." "You'll get used to it," Samuel said. "Rest a while. I'll see about food." He left her there and went downstairs. The air inside the inn smelled of stew and smoke. He sat near the window, his eyes scanning the street. Every sound made his shoulders tighten. He couldn't shake the feeling they were still being followed. When he came back up with food, Naya was awake, sitting by the window watching the hills. "They come soon," she said quietly without turning. Samuel set down the bowls. "We've come too far. They won't find us here." But deep down he knew she was probably right. That night the wind howled through the streets, carrying dust and broken leaves. The town's lanterns flickered in the dark. Samuel sat near the window, rifle across his knees. Naya slept lightly, turning now and then. It was close to midnight when Samuel heard horses again. 3 of them. He stood, heart pounding. Through the thin curtain he saw dark shapes near the town gate. Soldiers. He turned to Naya and whispered, "Wake up." Her eyes opened instantly. "They here?" Yes, they moved fast. Samuel grabbed their bags and Naya threw on her shawl. They slipped quietly out the back door, stepping into the cold night. The street was empty, but the sound of boots and voices carried from the front of the inn. Samuel led her through narrow alleys, past storage sheds and stables. They reached the edge of town where an old rail line ran through the hills. "Follow this," he said. "It'll lead to the woods." Naya stopped suddenly. "You not come?" "I'll slow them down," he said. "You keep going until the tracks end. There's a cabin near the river. You'll be safe there." Her eyes widened. "No, you come too." Samuel shook his head. "They'll follow the both of us. Someone's got to make sure they lose the trail." She looked at him for a long moment, her voice trembling. "You saved me again." He smiled sadly. "Guess that's just who I am." Before she could speak again, shouts echoed from the street. Samuel turned toward the noise. "Go, Naya, now!" She hesitated only a moment, then ran along the tracks, her figure melting into the darkness. Samuel moved toward the stables where his horse was tied. He climbed into the saddle just as the soldiers reached the main road. They saw him and shouted. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering a fence post beside him. Samuel kicked his horse hard and rode toward the open hills. The chase tore through the night. The wind whipped his face and the hooves thundered across the dry earth. He rode toward the canyon, hoping the narrow paths would hide him. The soldiers followed close behind, their torches flickering like ghosts. At the top of the ridge, Samuel stopped. He could see their lights below winding through the brush. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He looked once toward the north, where Naya would be by now, maybe halfway to the river. Then he turned his horse around and faced the men coming after him. When they reached the ridge, the lead soldier shouted, "You! Where's the girl?" Samuel's voice was steady. "Far from here. Leave her be. She's wanted by the fort." The soldier barked. Samuel shook his head. "You already took everything from her. Ain't that enough?" The soldiers spread out, rifles raised. Samuel stood tall in the saddle, his figure outlined against the stars. For a moment, no one moved. Then Father Mateo's words came back to him. "No blood here." He dropped his rifle slowly to the ground. "I won't fight you," he said, "but you won't find her either." The soldiers exchanged looks. One of them, the younger one, lowered his gun slightly. "He's not lying," he muttered. The officer scowled.
"Search the woods!"
They rode past him, disappearing into the trees. Samuel watched them go, his breath heavy with relief. He waited until their sounds faded, then turned his horse toward the river and began to ride again. By dawn, the sky turned pale. He found Naya near the cabin, sitting by the water. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears of disbelief. "You come back," she whispered. "I told you I would," Samuel said, sliding off his horse. She ran to him and held his arm, trembling. "I thought they'd kill you." "Not yet," he said with a faint smile. They went inside the small cabin. It was old, dusty, but safe. For the next few days, they stayed hidden. Samuel hunted and gathered what food he could. Naya cleaned and repaired their things. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. One evening, as they sat near the fire, she looked at him and said, "You lose home because of me." He shook his head. "Maybe I found one instead." She didn't speak, but her eyes said what her words could not. The days turned into weeks. No soldiers came. The sound of the river became their music, the stars their roof. Naya began to smile more, and Samuel, who had forgotten what hope felt like, found it again in the quiet rhythm of her presence. One morning, when the sun rose over the hills, Samuel stood outside watching the light spread over the valley. Naya stepped beside him, holding a small pouch made of leather. "My brother make this," she said softly. "I keep for luck." She placed it in his hand. "Now you keep." He tried to refuse, but she shook her head firmly. "You saved my life. This for you." Samuel looked at the small pouch, then at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled. "No, thank you." Years later, folks in the valley would still talk about the quiet rancher who vanished one winter and the native girl who was seen riding beside him months later, far to the west. Some said they found peace across the mountains. Others said they started a small farm near the river. No one really knew. But the story of that night, when a man carried a wounded girl on his horse and woke up tied to a tree, became a tale told around fires and camp tables. People said it wasn't about luck or fate. It was about doing what was right when the world had forgotten how. And somewhere beyond the hills, where the land turned gold under the sun, a rancher and a girl once lost to the world built a life no one could take from them.